justice in a meaningful way when we talk about Black business development and economic development. So I needed to start out with that as we segue into our discussion today. So with that, Charles.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Charles Warner. It's nice to be back with you all again for part two of our discussion on really Tulsa's Black Wall Street area, and then just the development of Black business enclaves in the United States. Where we left off, we were talking about what happened once the initial incident with Dick Rowland and the young lady who worked in the elevator in Tulsa. So apparently, just to catch people up, Dick Rowland was an elevator operator, and there was some sort of motion in the elevator and it caused him to stumble, and the young white woman who was in the elevator then screamed, and there were accusations that he was being improper with her. A lynch mob formed around the courthouse. Prominent men from the Black Wall Street business district went down to quell any attempt to lynch the young man who was being accused. And while there, and the men were, some of the white posse attempted to disarm the Black men who were there, and someone was shot by accident, and then in a few seconds, hundreds of shots were traded. And that was the beginning of what is called the Tulsa Race Riot, but is more accurately a race massacre. Many of these, in the Tulsa community, you had the Stratford Hotel, which was the jewel of Tulsa, 50-room hotel owned by a man who had a law degree from Indiana. He had a restaurant. There was the Dreamland Theater, owned by one of the area's first Black families. And that family, the Williams family, was the first family in Tulsa to have a car. Him being able to work on his own car, he then created a automotive business taking care of other people who eventually owned cars. In Tulsa, you had an oil boom, so people became, and so all the extravagancies and luxuries one could have were present there in Tulsa. One thing that I want to stress to you, while we did have this kind of flourishing of entrepreneurship in the Black community in Tulsa, there were a number of people who still had to deal with poverty and the struggles of being Black in America in a time when racism was the rule of the law, not only in the country, but definitely in the state of Oklahoma. So the Black business district, Black Wall Street, was attacked by citizens and by police. The National Guard, who was supposed to come in and help to settle the city, also joined in on the rioting. The Black business district was destroyed by the mob, but also from the air by, private citizens. There were a few private citizens who owned planes, and then the other planes would have had to come from the military or some sort of police forces using something similar to napalm to burn homes and churches and businesses. By the end of it all, the Black Greenwood district was decimated. There was no relief for the people. Insurance claims were not accepted because the official terminology for the attack was called a riot, and that is not covered by insurance. So you had people who were homeless, people without their businesses, without finances, really left to fend for themselves. And this is in 1921. The interesting part is there was a lawyer by the name of Buck Franklin. And Buck Franklin was the father of the noted historian John Hope Franklin. And Buck Franklin worked with these families to file lawsuits to also fight the government, who then wanted to claim that destroyed and burned out land by eminent domain to I guess, enlarge a railroad station. They were able to fend that off. The people who owned homes and owned their land were able to hold on for over a year. Many people lived in tents. The care came from either the few benevolent white folks in Tulsa and the surrounding area, and also from the Red Cross. But people lived literally in tents for over a year. Now, this is in 1921. The interesting point is by 1923, most of the Black Wall Street area was back, and by the 1930s, the Black Wall Street district was back in full and better than it was prior to 1921, and in 1921 when it was destroyed. So the racism, the violence, the coordinated attacks by government to rob these people of not only liberty, but of, property and life was not successful. And the Black community was able to rally and develop more businesses and have that community thrive. Tulsa is highlighted as a huge instance of Black people coming together and making enormous things happen. But Tulsa wasn't the only community where Black people worked together to establish a way for themselves in the United States. There are two other fine examples of the Black community coming together and establishing businesses. And really what they had to do was develop a separate society from scratch. And so like in Tulsa, the same was done in North Carolina. I'd also like to point out that Mr. Stratford, who was an attorney and a huge business owner, owned somewhere in the upwards of 50 rental properties, was the only person who was charged for a crime, and he was charged with the crime of inciting a riot. He had family in Chicago, and so what he did was someone bailed him out in Oklahoma, and he got on a train and headed for Chicago, never to return. But he lost all of what he had back in Oklahoma. And Mr. Stratford's family, like the folks in Tulsa, went on to thrive and progress. And his great-grandson, John Rogers, is the founder of the Aerial Capital Management in Chicago. And his granddaughter, Jewel Lon Fontan Mancarius, went on to become Solicitor General for the United States. So Mr. Stratford, like the people in Tulsa, was undaunted and went on to progress. Judge Graves, having Oklahoma roots, would you mind sharing any of your experiences, or maybe the experiences of those of your family members who were living in Oklahoma at the time or shortly thereafter?
Well, yes, let me just thank you, Charles, for that introduction. So just to add to what Charles has just presented, a couple of things. One, well, yes, there was, in the aftermath of the 1921 massacre, there was, after several years, there was a rebuilding and a resurgence, if you will, and which exhibited the resilience of the African-American community there in Tulsa. It never really attained the status that it had before. Many of those folks that either were killed, many of them left, as Charles indicated, left Oklahoma and moved either to the other parts of the country. But those who did remain, again, we have to acknowledge their resilience to rebuild. And of course, it's important we note that in 6 weeks from now, at the end of May, we'll mark the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Riot Massacre, if you will. And there'll be a series of workshops and programs beginning May 31st through the first week of June. So I would encourage folks to stay tuned to that. I'm sure there'll be some things on national media as well as social media closer to that date. Russell Westbrook, the NBA basketball player, has a documentary that's coming out on Black Wall Street during this time. So there will be some, revitalization of interest in what happened in Tulsa. As far as my family, my mother's from Oklahoma. I actually was born in Oklahoma, as I pointed out in part one, and I still have majority of my family members are still there in different parts of Oklahoma, some in the Tulsa area. And so it's interesting that my family, as it's passed down through my grandparents and parents and uncles and aunts, they were familiar with what happened in Tulsa. But people didn't talk about it. As I mentioned before, even John Hope Franklin, Buck Franklin's son, the historian, indicated that it was just a veil of silence. Even in the Black community, folks didn't really want to talk about what transpired there. But certainly the memory still lingers on to this very day. And certainly people of Tulsa, that there is a resurgence, if you will, even to today as we mark this 100th anniversary. But one other thing we're going to talk about, I think is important. Charles talked about the incident itself. Yes.
Judge Graves, as you speak,
what
I'd like to do is just have a few slides come up of the destruction of the community, so that those who are with us can take a look. Would you mind putting up the slides, please?
Absolutely.
And so here we just have some of the photographs of what was really happening right there during the riot and what it looked like afterwards. Yeah. You see smoke filling the sky, debris in the streets, buildings that were once standing are razed. The other thing is, look at the people who are casually walking through and posing for photographs as carnage is happening around them. So you have a complete society built from scratch and then all torn down in the matter of days. You can go through the slides.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Next slide, please.
And I would think another thing is that, and a couple of things we want to interject. There were stories, those who survived. I mentioned that in the last session, there's a piece called Before They Die that was actually put together by my law school classmate, Reginald Turner, several years ago, and Charles Ogletree, professor of law at Harvard, in which they documented and talked to actually folks who were children and witnessed what you're seeing now in these photographs. And they talked about how the rioters, the white rioters, those who perpetrated the massacre, were coming to their homes and take their silver that had purchased. So and just it was pillaging going on, was respectful. The other thing we should note is very important for all of us, that there were African American men who had actually fought in World War I veterans who had their uniforms on, who were trying to protect that young man Roland and who was incarcerated and who they intended to lynch. And they were shot, they were attacked. These, again, think of how disrespectful this was. These are men who had put their lives on the line in Europe a few years before, in World War I, trying to protect their own land now in America. And yet many of them were killed, shot and killed, in their uniform. So it just adds to the insult to injury, if you will, in terms of what transpired in Tulsa during that weekend, May 31st to June 2nd.
And this picture of the planes, actually, these are planes who that are figured to be used in the actual bombing. These were planes from an airfield not far away. And these aren't just models, but actual planes that they figured were used to drop bombs on the community. Next, And so now you're seeing this sort of bird's eye view of what the sky was like at the time, full of smoke, and people fleeing as everything that they had built and developed was razed.
Yes.
And obviously it caused migration, like Judge Graves was saying. Once this happened, there were people who just pulled up stakes and left Oklahoma for other parts of the country.
Yes. And so there's a couple of theories, and some those in study economics and economic development would appreciate this. In addition to the race factor, in terms of just the jealousy and envy that many whites had of this thriving, self-reliant Black community. part of the reason we think for the destruction was that this land was very valuable. So the bankers and the investors and the realtors took advantage of that and seized the land that was left vacated by the burning and the looting and the destruction of Black Wall Street, and took some of that land and turned it into business development opportunities for the white community.
So those two pictures, that was the Mother Zion Church before it was bombed, and now you're looking at it once it was intentionally bombed. This particular edifice was the heart and lifeblood of the Greenwood community. This was also a gathering place for meetings and rallies and important community discussions. So the fact that this building was targeted, this was definitely one of those sought out by air.
Yes.
So Judge Graves, a part of what you were saying, your family trek was from Oklahoma eventually to North Carolina, where a similar community was being developed, and not just in one place, but Durham gets highlighted as, I guess, the paragon of what can be done when people come together to really build a community and to make an economic way for themselves. Judge, you want to talk a bit about Durham, and then I'll share a few parts?
Sure. So it's interesting, as I indicated, my mother's from Oklahoma, and I was born in Oklahoma, but my father was from North Carolina. So at the age of 2, we relocated from Oklahoma back to North Carolina, Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And my father actually worked as an insurance agent for North Carolina Mutual Insurance Company before he worked for Winston Mutual Insurance Company, 2 African-American owned insurance agencies there. Both of them still exist in the state of North Carolina. Durham, ironically enough, and interestingly enough, was characterized by some as the Black Wall Street of the East. And so because of the economic development opportunities there, you had John Merrick and Mr. Aaron Moore, 2 entrepreneurs there. Mr. Moore was a barber. He started out as a barber, and he expanded his barbershops to he almost franchised his barbershops throughout Durham, and used those resources that he accumulated and acquired as a barber to invest. He pulled together a group of men to invest in this insurance company, to help actually assist African Americans with burials, which were very important at that time, and it expanded. So it was founded actually in 1898 and still exists today. If you ever go to Durham, you can Google it. They have I think a 3 or 4 story building there right off Interstate 40 in Durham, and they're still providing services to the African American community and others throughout the state of North Carolina and throughout the country. They have different affiliates around the country as well. But North Carolina Mutual Insurance Company, that same family also expanded and formed another insurance company. And then bank, Mechanics and Farmers Bank, because they felt that the African American community need a bank. And Mechanics and Farmers Bank, founded in Durham, still exists today. They have branches in Greensboro and in Winston-Salem, my hometown. So it's important to note that as someone asked the question the last time we met, what are the instances of Black economic development around the country? And we certainly can point to Durham, North Carolina, and you can Google it and get more information on Mr. Merrick and Mr. Moore and the men and women of Durham who founded this North Carolina Mutual Insurance Company and Mechanics and Farmers Bank. And those were catalysts for economic development opportunities there for lawyers and doctors, et cetera, to come to Durham. It's also important to know, especially in the South, that especially North Carolina rather, that there was a college there, North Carolina. It was called North Carolina College, and that's North Carolina Central University, based right there in Durham, in the heart of Durham. And so that was also a place for develop teachers and economists and business folk there on the college, and that helped feed the economic development opportunities there in the city of Durham. And again, it's important to know that those entities still exist today and still are thriving today. North Carolina Mutual Insurance Company and Mechanics and Farmers Bank. So I just wanted to highlight that in answer to the questions that were raised before, that this is just one example of, or just another example of African-American entrepreneur and business development and success in this country in the midst of a segregated South and being denied opportunities and access to finance and business opportunities. Black people decided we'll do this ourselves. We'll make our own opportunities. And of course, we tip our hat to those who founded North Carolina Mutual Insurance Company. And the fact that it still is around today is a tribute to them.
And Judge, I'd like to just highlight a bit of the ingenuity of these men and women who founded these institutions, particularly since we're talking about Durham, Farmers and Mechanics Bank, and then North Carolina Mutual. You know, you have someone using a skill, a trade that he learned in slavery, and then using that to go into business. And that one barbershop, like you said, becomes several barbershops, which become real estate, which gives him the money to buy those burial societies and create the insurance company. So it's important. Sometimes we don't understand, you know, we think we need large amounts of money or a lot of resources to start out on our way. But you can take what you have and build upon that, and then create, you know, that juggernaut that you dream to be able to create. And a testament to that is the fact that, like you said, here we are, over 100 years later, and the businesses are still intact and thriving and growing. And the barbering didn't only happen in Durham, but it also happened to be a waymaker in the next place that we talk about, which is Atlanta, Georgia. The sweet Auburn Avenue district is an area where Black people have been living since they left slavery and since people migrated there for opportunity after the Civil War, with the establishment of many of the historically Black colleges and universities that are there in Atlanta. The sweet Auburn Avenue is the main artery, if you will, of that old Fourth Ward community that is so touted and respected historically. On that street, you had all kinds of businesses, from restaurants to shoe stores, drug stores and soda fountains. You had the Odd Fellows, large Odd Fellows business building where professionals who weren't allowed access to office space, the surgeons, the Black doctors, were able to buy spaces out of the Odd Fellows building. You also had the capstone of the sweet Auburn Avenue, which was the Atlanta Life Insurance Company. And the Atlanta Life Insurance Company was founded by a former slave, Alonzo Herndon, who in slavery learned the trade of barbering. And Mr. Herndon's barbering turned from a small shop into a shop in a hotel to the best shop many folks said existed in the United States. It was called the European Barbershop, and he had all the furnishings and fixings, the modern fixings of the day. And he was able to turn his barbershop money into real estate holding and eventually buy smaller insurance companies, which became the Atlanta Life Insurance Company. And again, that company is still in existence today. Also, you have another business that's not there now. It's called the Standard Life Insurance Company, and it was probably the largest Black insurance company in the country. And the owner basically wanted to expand too quickly, too soon, and ended up losing the business. But what happened was many of those people he trained in the various businesses that he created went on to take over those leftover businesses and create new things that still survive. And one of those businesses is the Citizens Trust Bank, still on Piedmont, right there in the old Fourth Ward community in Atlanta. That is over, I think right now, soon to be 100 years old. And so You have some historical businesses folding, and then people from the community not wanting these businesses to falter and rescuing them and creating new entities. And Judge Graves pointed out something very interesting, and it's something that I think any place that is interested in having any kind of economic, true economic development and thriving happen, particularly for African-American communities, there's got to be some institution for higher education. In Oklahoma, you have an HBCU, you have Langston University. In North Carolina, you have a number of schools, but particularly close by where North Carolina Mutual is, like he said, North Carolina Central University. And in Atlanta, you have Morehouse College and Spelman College, Clark Atlanta University, Morris Brown College. You have the Morehouse School of Medicine, as well as the other institutions in the city. But there's a constant workforce coming to be there for those schools. And then you have a trained labor force ready to assume these positions and pick up where the old guard left off. Judge, how did college play into your family's development?
Well, just quickly, before I get to that, just quickly, let me just add about Sweet Auburn Avenue. In addition to what Charles just indicated, you should also note that Dr. King was actually born on Auburn Avenue. His house is a national monument there now. And ironically enough, he's buried on the same street, right? But 2 blocks down from where he was born is his grave with his wife there at the King Memorial, as well as Ebenezer Baptist Church, where he and his father both preached. So Auburn Avenue has such great historic significance, even to this very day, regarding in addition to the business and economic development initiatives that took place there, and as well as the fact it was the birthplace of Dr. King. As far as my family, yes, my mother actually was a graduate of Langston, the only historically Black college in the state of Oklahoma, and my father was a graduate of Hampton, and so education was always important to our family and stressed. But I think though but the experience that both mother and father had helped shape me too. I have 3 other siblings. Two went to historical Black colleges, the other 2 didn't, including myself. But we certainly appreciated the history and the legacy and the importance then and now of historical Black colleges to our community and to the economic development of the Black community, but also America as a whole. It's important to note that for a long period of time, most of the doctors and lawyers who practice in this country were products of historical Black colleges. And that's changed a little bit now because of the demographics, et cetera, but still a significant number of African-American leaders, business professionals, doctors, lawyers, engineers, still come from products of historical Black colleges, including Charles Warner Jr., who graduated Morehouse, and we acknowledge him and appreciate that. So the other thing I would say is this, going back to, if we could, before we open up the questions, there's one thing we want to talk about North Carolina, but it's important to note about North Carolina Mutual Insurance Company that I mentioned is still thriving today. Presently, it is the oldest and largest African-American life insurance company in the United States, founded again in 1898. And I think the business people would appreciate it, has over $2.4 billion of insurance in force and surplus exceeding $9 million. So it's and in spite of everything, again, we have to appreciate the fact, whether we're talking about Sweet Auburn Avenue in Georgia, or North Carolina Mutual and Mechanics and Farmers Bank in North Carolina, and other examples around the South in particular, we can cite. These businesses were organized and were thriving in the midst of segregation and oppression. There were oppression and certainly lynchings and shootings and killings happening all around them. But yet these men and women who organized these businesses and set in force these businesses continued to fight and struggle to keep them thriving and working for the Black community in spite of all the obstacles they were facing and around them. I think that's a further tribute, I think, to all of them. whether it's North Carolina Mutual or Atlanta Mutual and the Herndon family in Atlanta, or wherever we can, other businesses we can cite. I think it's very important to make that historical observation and acknowledgement in this day and time. And I would just segue that into the town I grew up in, Winston-Salem, North Carolina. There was a business, there were the African-American businesses there, developed out of a sense of self-reliance and self-help. So some of you may be familiar with the South, the segregation during this time, especially when it comes to buses. We've heard a lot about the Montgomery bus boycott, and which was indicative of what happened in most places in the South, that if African Americans in the bus systems across the South, if African Americans got on buses, they had to sit in the back and whites sat in the front. And if whites got on the bus, Black people would have to give up their seats, stand up in order to give their seats to whites. That was the tradition and the culture and the law through most of the South. Well, in my town in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, some Black men got together and decided rather than subject themselves to that type of oppression, they would form their own bus company. Think about that, their own bus company. So these Black men 13 Black men came together, pooled their resources. And at this time, this is back in the early 1900s, there were trolleys first. And they called it, interestingly enough, Safe Bus Company, indicating that it would be safe for Black people to ride the bus without fear of retaliation or hostility or degradation and disrespect. So they formed this Safe Bus Company. And it actually was formed in 1921 and existed until 1972 when it was actually bought out by the city's larger bus company. But for all those years, the Black take on this quickly. Safe Bus Company served the Black community. And so the scores of African Americans who worked in the tobacco factories, which were primarily in the downtown area, Winston-Salem, or that was the Reynolds Tobacco Company, Winston-Salem Camel Cigarettes, some of you are familiar with. Then, of course, in Winston-Salem was the headquarters of Hanes Hosiery, Hanes Underwear, Hanes Hosiery, headquartered and founded by the Hanes family there in Winston-Salem. So a lot of African Americans worked in that factory, which was also near the downtown area. So, and then many worked at the college, Winston-Salem State, at the hospital. So the Safe Bus Company serviced the Black community. However, there were scores of Black people, as you can appreciate, who worked in the white community, who worked either at the hospitals in the white community, or at the Wake Forest University in the white community, or worked in white homes as gardeners, as maids, as cooks, as nannies. And so they had to get to their jobs. So the way it worked was they would get on the Safe Bus in their community, ride downtown, and then transfer to the white-owned bus, the city-owned bus company, and then go to work. Problem was, you could ride on the Safe Bus, you could sit anywhere you wanted to, because because again, there were no prohibitions. But once you got on the white-owned bus, you had to sit in the back. So it just shows you the hypocrisy and the irony of living in the South during that period of time, and the disrespect. But again, the saving grace was, even though you had to get on that white bus to ride, white-owned bus to ride to work, when you came back downtown at the end of the day and transferred back to Safe Bus to go home, you had at least the respect to be safe, if you will, ride in front of the bus and feel the comfort and at least a part of your day. And I think, and that bus company again thrived. I had the Mr. Hampton Hayes, who was the last general manager of the Safe Bus Company. I went to school with his daughter, Deborah, who's still alive and still working there in North Carolina. But it's important to note, again, this is not another example of, and at the time, the Safe Bus Company, you can Google it and check it out yourselves, was the largest Black-owned transportation company in the country during its heyday. Safe Bus Company, Winston-Salem, North Carolina. So again, another example, another shining example of Black self-help and self-reliance and accommodated in the midst of segregation, and it was very successful. So I wanted to highlight that, Charles.
No, and you actually brought something to mind about the importance of these institutions then, but even their impact on society now. If you look at the Ebenezer Baptist Church right there on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, the new U.S. Senator Raphael Warnock is the current senior pastor at Ebenezer Church. And, his opportunity and success of becoming a Black United States Senator from Georgia really is the culmination of a lot of the work that those businessmen put into building the community. And not only did they, make money and establish financial institutions, but they were also the people who fed the civic work of the community. And I think that's one thing that we also need to highlight, the importance of the responsibility of the business community to help people, finance homes and start their dreams and donate to the orphanage. And, Alonzo Herndon was responsible for making sure that the school children had fresh milk. And he, financed the orphanage. So these are things that the chamber should be thinking about, of course, when they do their work. But if we're talking about creating and sustaining a Black business community, we need to understand that there are some current, some patterns across the geographical locations and the circumstances. Love for the community, being able to be supported by the people so that ultimately you have independence, celebrating legacy and heritage, and supporting education and having a institution that brings talent and cultivates talent at home. New Haven was supposed to have the first historically Black college, which would have happened had things gone the way that some of those early planners had planned in 1832. What would New Haven be like if there was a university now, over 150 years old, having fed the community for that long? What would New Haven's economic state be like? What would the talent pool be like? What would the innovation in the city be like? So just keep that in mind.
Yes, it's a good point. And so, I think Charles's point about the importance of the business community and the political community working together for the good of the whole. If I could go back to Atlanta just quickly for a moment, some of you may remember, at least from recent history, that the Mayor Maynard Jackson, who served Atlanta for many years, and Maynard Jackson made a point, and actually was a graduate of North Carolina Central Law School, by the way. But Maynard Jackson made a point that as mayor, he wanted to make sure that he helped further develop the African American business community. So when they built that great airport, and many of you have been to Atlanta, been through Atlanta airport, he made sure that when they were setting up the businesses that were going to service the airport, well, two things. One, he wanted to make sure the African American contractors had a role in building the airport first and foremost. And he actually bumped heads with the contracting community there in Atlanta. But as mayor, he said he's not going. Not one shovel of dirt is going to be dug until he has some contracts or agreements in place to make sure the African American contractors had a piece of this multi-billion-dollar. And he fought. And then when it came time to put businesses in the airport, entrepreneurs, he gave out African American entrepreneurs an opportunity to actually set up their barbecue places and other kind of boutiques, et cetera, in Atlanta's airport. So today, you travel through Atlanta airport and you walk through there, to this very day, you see the results of his labor over 30 years ago and making sure that happened. So again, it's important for the business community to understand while you have a significant role, it's important to have the support of the political community, political leadership, strong, forceful, defiant political leadership to make things happen. And I think that certainly manifests itself in Atlanta through Maynard Jackson. And it happened in other cities as well. Washington, D.C. was another example, but Marion Barry, with all his faults and shortcomings, he made sure and pushed for Black economic development in the city of Washington, D.C. And that's what it takes. But it takes a partnership, if you will, as we talk about going forward to help build up economic development in the African American community.
Hey, Judge, we got some questions
Yes.
about the
Sure.
Safe Bus Company.
Okay.
Did the
Go ahead.
Safe Bus route go into the white community, or was it only located in the Black community?
That's a good question, and actually, and the short answer is no. So it's the way they worked it out. I guess the business, the Safe Bus company owners sat down with the transit people and said, "Listen, this is what we'll do." And it was again, this was the era of segregation. This is what we'll service the Black community. You don't have to worry about it. We got it. We got it covered. So Safe Bus covered the entire African American community, which was segregated. There were hardly any, hardly any African Americans who lived in the white community, not at all, because of segregation laws and customs. And conversely, even though there were a few whites who lived in certain segments of the Black community, it didn't matter. The Safe Bus company serviced the Black community solely, and the central meeting place, transfer place was downtown, the middle of downtown. So Safe Bus would come downtown, and if you as a Black person needed to go to your job or go to the white community for whatever it might be, you had to get on the other bus to get to your destination. But the short answer is no. They worked that out, and they just worked it out. That was the best way for survival and success for both bus companies, and it worked for a while. It was, and Safe Bus was very, yes.
Was it allowable for white citizens there to be able to take the Safe Bus company, or it was totally
absolutely
not?
No, absolutely. And that was it. That's always the irony of segregation and during this era, that whites could pretty much do what the hell they wanted to do. So whites could get on they could if they needed to go to the Black community, or for example, what's the same state, the African Americans in the Black community. If you needed to go there to take a class or to teach there, whatever, or do business there, or any other place in the Black community, you can certainly get on a Safe Bus. There were no prohibitions for anyone, for any race, and anyone could ride Safe Bus. And actually, anyone could ride the other buses. It's just that you had to sit in the back if you were African American, a person of color. You had to sit in the back and adhere to the segregation rules at the time. But it was like it was an accommodation that was worked out between the two bus companies. But it was open to anyone, but it serviced the entire Black community, and it was awkward, if you can appreciate the awkwardness of that arrangement, but it was unique, and that it was the only, again, to our knowledge, the only African American owned bus company in America during this era.
Judge, question for you around.
Yeah.
Because of the historical implications of what we've talked about today, how does that play out, if it does at all, with reparations or any kind of form of reparations?
It's interesting. That remains, and that's a good question, and it remains a compelling question today. There have been and continue to be discussions, forums on reparations around the country. Based on what happened in Tulsa, certainly that's an ongoing discussion that will come up again during next month's commemoration. But even around for African Americans nationally, it remains a compelling question. I believe that the Congress, quite frankly, I think is going to have some congressional hearings on this issue. I believe there are law schools and colleges are having forums around the country. So I think it's something that certainly is something that's on the table. I know some of you may know that Evanston, Illinois, right outside Chicago, actually the council actually voted to give reparations to the Black community. This is a story for you. Maybe Google it, check it out. Evanston, Illinois. They actually voted to award reparations to the African American community. It was pushed by an African American city council person, but there was a history there in Evanston about again, not as tragic as what happened in Tulsa, but there was eminent and other type of governmental initiatives that were taken to seize land from the Black community back over 100 years ago, and there was an historic acknowledgement of that, and that prohibited, as we talk about generational wealth, certainly which we can talk about with Tulsa, but there were other places around the country where that was inhibited and snatched away. So the town of Evanston, Illinois, actually voted to give reparations to the Black community there, Black residents there. Controversial. and historic in nature, but it's something that other cities may start looking at, and other states might. But we're a long ways from national. I think a long ways from national acknowledgement. But it's something that certainly remains on the table. I agree.
And Judge, recently in California, there was a coastal town who did the same thing for a family who was driven out, who owned a seaside hotel business, and they were driven out. And I think there was a vote recently to pay some form of reparations to the descendants of that particular family who owned those properties, because the government actually now owns those properties. Mm-hmm.
Yes, absolutely. And again, going back to just quickly, as some other questions, and we can count that. Then there are countless examples of government seizure of Black-owned land. If some of you have ever heard of, probably been to Hilton Head, South Carolina. At one time, all that area, Beaufort, South Carolina, all that in Hilton Head, was owned by Black people. That land was owned by African Americans in the aftermath of the Civil War, and it was seized and taken away. So, by different means, of course. But that's some of the most valuable land now in the country, in that Hilton Head area. As you know, it's a resort, and people, folks, $1 million homes, et cetera, golf course, et cetera. But that land was examples of African American owned land taken away, seized. And again, think about, as Charles indicated, think about the generational wealth today that could have accrued by now if African Americans still owned the land like Hilton Head or in other places like Charles talked about in California. And there are countless examples of that. And it goes back to the point of reparations. How do we document that? How do we codify that in a way that folks can get some justice, economic justice? And so I don't know. It remains an ongoing issue and challenge for all of us.
So if you had to make a recommendation, if you were saying, I am giving a roadmap for development of like a redevelopment of a Dixwell or a community for African Americans, where would you start with a revitalizing business in the same way we've talked about today?
That's just a good question. I think if you look at what's happening now in the Dixwell area, we talked about this in part one, but it bears repeating just quickly. The Concord organization group, I think both Mr. Highsmith and Mr. Highsmith, who's a member of the board, I think, of the chamber, has been the catalyst for making that happen. I'm hopeful and optimistic that the economic development to revitalize Dixwell Avenue with moderate and middle-income housing, business development, et cetera. The development of the Q House, the community house right across the street, will hopefully provide job opportunities, economic opportunities, and investment opportunities for those in the Black community, and maybe give opportunities for these young men and women who need choices. I think part of the problem we face with the violence in our community and the hopelessness is that a lot of these young people feel that's the only choice. The options are limited. We have to provide opportunities and give them more options so they can survive here and thrive in our community. So yes, Concord is just one example. I think further development such as that, not in the Dixwell, New Hallville area, and I think when you look at the Hill and Fairhaven as well, in terms of the Black and Brown communities, in terms of the strong economic development initiatives to build up those communities and revitalize those communities. I think it starts with that. And provide this help and hope. And I think this is where the chamber and business initiatives like the ones that on this call could help and assist the political leaders in trying to provide guidance and directions as to how we can make this happen. Because I think it's important and critical for development of not just the Black and Brown communities, but for New Haven as a whole. And I think that example could be replicated around the country, and we can cite examples around the country where it is happening in a meaningful way. But for right here in New Haven, I think that would be my answer. We need to support entities like Concord and others like that to expand, be more expansive and creative, and trying to help encourage development. Because a lot of these young men, I know we're running out of time, but a lot of these young men and women who have skills, have skill sets. They just have to be rechanneled and redirected in terms of how they use their skills, the skills and skills that they have into business opportunities for legitimate business development, as opposed to what they're doing now.
Well, Judge Graves, Charles, thank you so much. I think history makes such a big difference, understanding it. A lot of the answers to the questions that we have about the future we can find by looking back at Black Wall Street. How do you make those changes? And I love how you transitioned it into what we're doing in the future today. And so I can see a part 3 that we can do this as well, because there is the today. You mentioned Concorp. Next Haven is another big project in New Haven that's making a huge impact and has opportunity for a tremendous impact. So great conversation again. Thank you to everyone who joined us. And this is not, as I said, this is not the end of the dialogue on this, just the beginning. And we're going to keep that going. So thank you again. Thank you to Charles. Thank you to Judge Graves.
Thank you.
Thanks
so
for
much.
having us.
Thank you for having us. Appreciate the time and opportunity.
Oh, definitely. Anytime. And you can find this recording. We'll put this on our YouTube page. So if you know someone who missed it today, direct them there. Definitely, as you know, if you're on this call right now, worth their time. Well, thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you. Have a good day. Thank you so much. Take care. Thank you, man.
Guys.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you.